Hello everyone, welcome back to Altengrad city in City Skylines. In the previous episode, we built the new modern bridge to replace the damaged historical one. It's in a slightly different position, it's bigger, it also allows cars, so there had to be some more changes to the following infrastructure on both ends. Overall, it was a project focused more on the building, on the technical side of it, but today there is a project in front of us that requires us to talk about history a lot more. We will move away from the city past the industrial zone and we will build the largest residential expansion that the city ever saw. In the background, I'm going to be preparing some custom buildings and maybe some layout, but first I would like to do a little reminder or highlight what this series is, when and where we are. This series aims to build a fictional Central European city through 1920s all the way to modern times. Now we are in the 1950s, which is always written in the opening logo and right here in the time-lapse. In episode 55, I explained why, after World War II, the city and its fictional country ended up in the communist Eastern Bloc. This is a map highlighting the communist countries of the second half of the 20th century. Altengrad takes inspiration from these four: Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Those countries were not part of the Soviet Union or USSR, which is up here. Therefore, Altengrad is not a Soviet city, because it's not in the Soviet Union. Simple as that. I understand that when talking about communism, communist urban planning, central planned economies, architecture, and general way of life, it is usually through the Soviet Union. And even though it did influence the rest of the communist countries, some more than others, some fields more than others, certain generalization, simplification, and stereotyping is just not accurate, and sometimes even completely wrong. Things are just more complicated. Even in the four countries and their regions, some things were done differently. This series does not aim to provide a complete, detailed historical background for absolutely every little thing. Just introduce the context relevant to projects that we will be building, but maybe sometimes I will go into more details if I want to. And again, Altengrad is a fictional city combining inspiration taken from the region while working with the limitations of City Skylines. Now let's focus on today's project. What am I building here is a new, mostly residential area built as a planned new city district. After communism was established in Eastern Central Europe, massive industrialization started. New city districts and even whole new cities needed to be made to house workers suddenly moving to work in this new industry. Examples of such projects are the Nová Huta district in Krakow, Poland, Poruba in Ostrava, Czech Republic, and cities Eisenhüttenstadt in Germany, Dunaui Város in Hungary, and Nová Dubnica in Slovakia. Many other examples exist, as well as smaller developments on just single streets, single blocks, and so on. Since these projects started around the first half of the 1950s, they were planned in the Socialist Realism style, because it was officially required by the communist regimes. We already introduced the style 2 episodes back, but let's return to that. Outside of the Soviet Union, the style has a somewhat weird place. It wasn't a direct evolution of contemporary local styles. It arrived as a political order, and just a couple of years later it disappeared almost as fast as it arrived, after the death of Stalin and the critique of the style by the next Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev for being too expensive, among other reasons. Nevertheless, huge projects were built in it, and even bigger plans were made for rebuilding cities and building gigantic megalomaniac projects. This was connected to the very political nature of this style. Architecture and urban planning was supposed to play a role in social change. As the workers built socialism, their environment should have been easily understood. No more elitist architecture of the past. It should have also made workers more motivated, hyped, and proud of their work. Architects often complained that socialist realism for architecture was only very vaguely described, and it wasn't clear exactly how they should design things. It is important to mention that socialist realism in architecture wasn't just brought to Central Europe as a precise set of guidelines, blueprints, or examples. This is why all those projects that I mentioned earlier in those different countries are very much different, even though they share the same roots. Some architects were directly inspired by their travels to the Soviet Union. Some architects decided to go their own way. Some were more convinced communists, believing the hype, Some were just quietly doing their job in fear of losing it and just accepting the style because they had to. And some even decided to speak up about it. The common critique was that it was too artificial, that it was assumed that this is what people want, and that it would probably have the opposite societal effect as a result. Another aspect of the new building style was a reorganization of architectural work in general that went even beyond social realism in the future. These were, among others, the principles of industrialization and unification of architectural work. These go hand in hand because in order to industrialize, to make things cheaper and quicker, you need to make fewer variations of a product, so you need unification. And architects, now in large nationalized building companies, were bound by these principles. This meant that in these big residential developments, there were only a few flat types and layouts. All kinds of details were unified: stairs, doors, windows. Even some decorations were sometimes prefabricated and put on the facades as a whole. But in this time period, the Socialist Realism projects were still mostly made of bricks, so certain variations were possible and even allowed. This included various important buildings at the fronts of squares or open areas like schools, government offices, or just ordinary buildings but in more geometrically prominent places like entrances to the whole district, squares again, and so on. Some architects were not pleased with these principles as they thought that it degrades their work to just assembling a few elements from one catalog. But they didn't know yet that unification would get a lot tighter in the following decades. The urban planning of these areas is probably the main highlight that is considered very good even today. Some especially larger projects were planned and built as a whole new cities, not just suburbs, even the ones that were just new districts on the sides of bigger cities, like we are doing here. The layout characteristics followed a traditional city principle of main streets and closed squares with more shops and other amenities. Typical were also large, semi-closed inner blocks with lots of open areas inside them. Even some Western principles of the time were applied. The architects of the Poruba district in Ostrava, Czech Republic, for example, took inspiration from the big boulevards of Paris for the main street. The main architect of Nová Huta in Krakow, Poland, applied the neighborhood unit principle initially developed in New York City in the early 1900s. This principle was applied simply from looking at Google Maps in various other projects as well. It meant that the whole district was subdivided into parts that housed certain numbers of people and included all the necessary things for day-to-day lives, like school, daycare, clinics, and so on. It's also important to remember that these socialist realism districts were one of the top priorities from the political point of view. It was important to construct high-quality areas that would fulfill the political order, like I introduced it earlier, so they could act as a showcase of socialism. And it tied to the other priority, which was industry, that needed to house all the workers fast. This means that the projects received adequate funding and workforce, although not to the extent to fully go through with some original plans. Acquiring land was also not a problem, as it was simply taken from the previous owners, farmers mostly, if it was still theirs and not already nationalized. Historical pictures, aerial views, and even some interviews with the original inhabitants tell us that the builders sometimes cut corners with things like street accessories, sidewalks, or greenery. The large squares and main streets, of course, had priority, but the state of some streets and open spaces further inside the blocks were not that great. Overall, very few trees that then needed to be added in next decades to improve this situation. Of course, today, when we see these areas, we associate them with lots of greenery, but it wasn't always like that. Decorative flowers were also not that numerous, apart from the main squares, in front of some important buildings, around statues, and so on. When asked about the living conditions, some citizens of the Poruba district and its mayor said that the flats are reasonably large, with good sense of privacy, acoustic isolation is apparently okay, compared, for example, to the prefabs later, and if properly maintained, the buildings are absolutely fine to live in, even after 60-70 years. Now, the communist symbols. Here it's difficult to generalize. Some houses in some projects show various murals or reliefs with themes mostly related to workers of those factories nearby. I only have one or two in the game, so I didn't add those because they look slightly different for this purpose. I'm going to use them sometime else. Pictures show maybe an occasional flag of the country and the Soviet Union, but again, mostly on like important buildings and such. Statues are also not that common from historical pictures and just, historical accounts. There's, for example, that case in Nová Huta of the Lenin statue, which was actually unveiled a long time after the place was built or started to be built, and the locals didn't like it at all. So overall, the symbol situation wasn't all that crazy, apart from celebrations of holidays, of course. When the time of socialist realism ended, the architectural style was quickly abandoned, and lots of these areas were not finished in it, although the urban plans still remained, and the districts would have been continued, just with different looking buildings and maybe some changes to layouts, depending on the different projects, of course. It's important to remember that not all places were absolutely the same. Not every architect followed the same principles. That is going to be all for the historical introduction, and now we are going to jump into the time lapse and just catch up to it, because there are a lot of things that already happened. So, as you can see, we are building on a completely empty ground. There were just some farmlands and some tree lines, but we just got rid of all of that, and we can build whatever we want, just like the architects of those projects, real-life projects. Now, if you know those real-life projects, if you at least saw them on maps or something, that you are immediately going to recognize some elements that I'm building in here. So, for example, I started with that like a semicircular building, which is very much inspired by the same looking structure, or at least, geometrically, same looking structure from the Poruba district in Ostrava, Czech Republic. Now, that building in real life was supposed to be like at the head of the entire place, so the entrance, the main entrance, monumental entrance to that area. It kind of isn't today if you look at the layout and the streets that are aiming towards that district, but plans changed. The district was not completed as it was supposed to be built. It was supposed to be built just so much more bigger, but anyway, I digress. That building is the inspiration for this semicircular building that I have over here. Of course, the building looks slightly different because I'm, limited by what I can use from the workshop, but, the principle is kind of the same. So it's like a monumental looking building. It's not exactly in the center, at the start of the area, but it's in the center on some kind of a side of like a the mainest square of the place, right? The square is not going to be finished because this entire place, I'm going to think of it as dividing it into maybe 4 quadrants or something like that. And we are now going to build the initial quadrant. And because, these kinds of buildings took time to build, and in the meantime, socialist realism was just not required anymore, we are then going to follow up on this episode, on this construction, in the next episodes, in next decades. So we are going to use different buildings, maybe even slightly different layouts and styles to complete it. And this area is eventually going to become some sort of a like a museum of architecture, if you think about it this way, because every quadrant is going to be slightly different, slightly more modern. If that's going to be for the better of urban planning and amenities and everything, that's going to be for us to decide later. But anyway, let's now return back to these buildings. So the semicircular building, it wasn't ready like that from the workshop. It's only like a quarter circle that you can download. It has like a tower on the side, but fortunately you can convert that into PO and get rid of the tower, which is like a separate sub-building. Now, the central arch through it, the way through it, was not there. I had to cut the corners of the building and actually put that arch in it. What's really good is that I'm basically using like 2 sets of buildings. Those like slightly fancier are, I'm not exactly sure where they are from Russia somewhere. And the second pack is as well. It's the Avtovo district, I believe it's called that way. And those actually come with lots of props as well. All these different arches and like gates kind of, and just these kinds of like connectors between the buildings that are supposed to be placed around the buildings in the blocks to just complete those blocks, make them a bit spicier and something. So that's actually very good that I can use pretty much the same color, not even think about it too much, and just build the area a bit more freely, that I already have these buildings like that. Of course, some of these, as you can see, I need to convert to PO and just modify them. Those are the fancier buildings because they are much taller. I didn't really want to have the buildings that tall, so for the fancier buildings I cut away like 2 floors and from the middle of the building because it kind of looks best with the model, and then I had to of course cut the holes for the arches and make sure that the arches kind of fit inside them and roads fit in those arches as well. So the layout of this place is, so the semicircle is inspired by Poruba in Ostrava, but the layout is inspired by Nova Huta because it also has the main square and it has these like 45-degree roads radiating from it. So that's exactly the inspiration from there. Now, in that place, those 45-degree roads are kind of the main roads. They also have trams going on them. In this case, I made them slightly less significant, slightly smaller, because they are also originating from those smaller arches through that semicircular building. So, it kind of makes sense. But, then again, just like I explained before, Altengrad is a fictional city. I'm not recreating one-to-one these real-life places, right? Another inspiration that I took from real life are those 2 towers at the start of this district. That is actually something really cool that you can see in, again, Poruba in Ostrava. There are these, I think there are 2 towers as well there. They look slightly different, both of them, and they have these tops made with very like Renaissance looking elements. This was actually common for the Socialist Realism style because this was even mentioned by Stalin himself, that Socialist Realism projects can and probably even should include these kinds of historical elements from like good parts of history, let's say, of these countries. And Renaissance in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, was considered to be like one of the brightest parts of the past. So these kinds of elements were actually commonly used. And these towers, like I said, these are actually also in the Poruba district, and they are looking very similar to what I built right here. They have these tops that are having these kinds of like Renaissance, how do you call them, shields, roof shields or something. And I had those in City Skylines because I have all those Renaissance buildings made by Titan. And fortunately, you can just cut these away from the rest of the building and put it on top here. And since they are already procedural objects, I can recolor them and match the colors with the rest. So instead of using that, Renaissance white color, the original color, I'm just going to make them into this like a social realism, slightly brownish color, orange-ish brownish or something like that. So, it's looking rather bizarre. Maybe it's looking a bit cursed. I'm not really sure how Titan is going to feel about this if he sees this, but it's looking great. Like it's like a so bizarre element that it's actually looking great in this area. And this was also something that architects, I suppose, kind of wanted to do because it broke away from the unification of these places. So this is exactly those kind of non-unified elements that they were allowed to do, and I would assume that any excuse to just not do unification would probably be very welcome, even though this one is a bit strange, but still it's looking okay in this area. I like it. Even in this district that we are building, it definitely breaks that unified look of the area. Now, I'm really sorry, but I did not record the part where I changed these buildings. So these buildings had one major issue that I needed to get rid of. It had the pavement below them. And when you take a look at Google Maps of pretty much all of the projects that I mentioned in the introduction and the rest of them as well, there really isn't that much pavement in these places apart from the main squares, main plazas. So the buildings usually have these like very narrow entrances towards them. Today there are obviously like parking lots like cutting into those grassy areas, but still there are these like tiny entrances to the buildings, but there isn't like one continuous pavement in front of it, right? So I had to do that somehow. The problem is that obviously if you use Surface Painter, you are also going to delete pavement on the sides of streets, and I didn't want to have that. I would have to then put it there like manually, which is not that big of a deal if the terrain was flat, and it's not. This area is actually kind of uneven, so it would be just a major headache to just detail it with like ploppable pavement. So I went into the asset editor, and all of these buildings I changed so that they are not going to have the pavement below them at all. And I can just add the pavement wherever I need it, on the main street, for example, on the squares, like I said, and do these tiny entrances like I am doing in them right here with these nice decals that I'm using for this exact purpose everywhere else in the city and even in my other series, because they just look absolutely perfect for it. And they even have that like sprouting grass through them, so it might actually look a bit historical accurate. Now, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, and since I already had those buildings in the asset editor and I was already like having the textures dump with mod tools, I just made them so that you can recolor the roofs. I know that, for example, the Nova Huta district has the buildings kind of gray even from the top. I suppose it's like the availability of the materials of the time in that region. For example, the Poruba district probably had the roofs red. I'm not exactly sure because I only saw black and white. And today there is like a combination of various colors, but mostly red still though. So I assume that they were all red, and in Altengrad it just looks so much better. There is like a color contrast now compared to the roads. And since we are just finishing this project, there's not really going to be that many tall trees, and this red is just going to look so much better than the gray. So this was a good decision. And it also kind of customizes the assets so that they are not going to look like the original Russian ones, so that we can just pass them for something original for Central Europe in Altengrad. Now, one more thing that I wanted to talk about, I'm not really sure if I mentioned it, but I'm not doing trams into this region. It makes sense to put public transport, like beefy public transport, into this region, but we are not going to do trams, we are only going to do buses, which was something that was done in some districts. For example, the Nova Huta has trams. I'm not exactly sure about the years, but in the 1950s they did extend one of the tram lines there. But in other parts of Europe, Central Europe, they were not exactly doing trams all that much. I don't want to go into details. I already did some research, but today we are doing residential expansion, so I don't want to combine that. Obviously, this area just combines all the different topics and everything, but it's only like a 25-minute episode, so I cannot fit them all in. So we're not going to do trams, but I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to make like a special tram episode in the 60s probably. So don't worry, that is going to come. Cars are also going to be a topic for a different episode, but I just wanted to build, you could have seen me build like a tiny little parking lot there on that one of the main roads. This is actually something that I have seen in the historical aerial pictures from the late 50s. And there were obviously not that many cars, but people did have cars. There were not a lot of cars, but there were some. But again, I don't want to go into details. We are going to do a car episode later. This episode was, of course, not planned because I mentioned with that bridge video earlier that we are just going to do the industry. But you guys wrote me a lot of comments with that Socialist Realism video that I should take a look at the Nova Huta and some other districts. And I did. And I felt like it's a perfect project for City Skylines, so I built one. So definitely keep them coming, these kinds of suggestions. And if there are going to be enough people talking about some common things, then I will definitely consider adding it. I am having that list on my Discord server where you can just see what kind of projects are planned for the next decades. But if there's going to be something interesting, then I have absolutely no problem adding it. Now, as you can see, the trees in this place, they are not exactly all that prominent looking, are they? One of the biggest issues with city skylines, if you want to do like huge open areas or like construction sites, you cannot really have that much variation with surfaces. So as you can see, I'm kind of trying maybe here and there to have like muddy, dirty surfaces with decals. I also built all those mud roads on the sides to like kind of symbolize that, you know, this is like a construction site. But realistically, it should be a lot dirtier. There should be a lot more mud and sand everywhere. But you can't really do that in city skylines. It would be much better if you had like different brushes for different types of mud or something. Right now you can only do it with decals, but you can only do so much with decals. You cannot overlap them, for example, if you want to make videos. Otherwise the textures are going to fight and all of those other related issues. So just pretend that this is still looking like a construction site mostly, all right? But anyway, the trees, yeah, so there are not that many of them and they are obviously tiny. So I could use the tree anarchy mod, the new one that I'm using in Altengrad, to actually scale down the trees and make them look really tiny, very young, and they need to have time to grow up. But there are still not that many of them, and that is the problem that we will have to solve in the coming decades. Also, I don't have much time, but there is that little black area right behind that school building. That is like my attempt to create like a cinder surface. I'm not really sure what it's called, but it's like the old vintage surface of these kind of sports ground. I actually remember those from my elementary school days. They were absolutely disgusting to do sports on, but again, from aerial views, these were absolutely everywhere. There are going to be more schools, more like bigger sports areas in this area. But anyway, I ran out of cinematics, so guys, thank you for watching this episode of Altengrad, and I hope you liked it. If you did and you want to help the video, then you can do all the usual things on YouTube, like clicking thumbs up, leaving a comment, sharing the video with your friends or whoever you think might like it. And if you are new here, you can subscribe to the channel. And also, if you like this a lot and want to directly support it, then you can become a channel member. A lot of people already did, and I thank you so much for your support. Thank you again, and goodbye.